Story 1. The Manager's Warnings. I remember it clearly. The day I walked into that job interview for the night security guard position at a local department store. It was supposed to be a straightforward job, something to fill the nights and pad the wallet. The store was an old structure, with walls that held decades of commerce. The manager, an old man with eyes full of years of experience, seemed almost reluctant to hire me. As we sat across from each other in the break room, the smell of stale coffee hanging in the air, he laid it out straight. "We've had a few incidents," he said, his voice lowering as if the very walls around us could hear. "Movement, shadows, things that fall off shelves with no explanation, and sounds, strange sounds that don't belong. Nobody has ever been hurt, but for some, it's a little bit too much to handle." I raised an eyebrow. "So the place is haunted, huh?" I asked, chuckling a little bit. He didn't smile. Instead, he offered a nod. "Believe what you will, but I feel like it's my duty to tell you beforehand. I wasn't a believer in such things. I'd outgrown the fear of the dark. I didn't believe that monsters, ghosts, and goblins were hiding in the shadows. So I accepted the job, my chuckle masking the tiny flicker of doubt that maybe, just maybe, I was stepping into something I couldn't control. The first night arrived, and with it, a sense of nervousness I hadn't expected. The store was different at night, devoid of the comforting hustle of daytime activity. It was just me, my heavy boots echoing on the linoleum floors, the hum of the fluorescent lights above, and the silent atmosphere of 1,000 unsold goods watching me. I took my post at the security desk, a tiny island in a sea of shadows. Monitors flickered with the black and white ghosts of empty aisles and mannequins dressed in the latest fashions. It was on these screens that I first saw it. A flicker of movement that had no source. A flutter that could have been a trick of the light, but felt like so much more. I tried to ignore it, to immerse myself in the routine checks of the cameras, the sip of lukewarm coffee, the flip through a worn magazine. But it felt like the store was watching me with eyes that seemed to come from the very bones of the building. It was when I heard a clatter, a sound like metal on tile, that my resolve began to crumble. I found myself drawn into the heart of the store, my flashlight cutting a swathe through the darkness. The aisles were vast, the shelves towering above me like silent lookouts. There, in the middle of the floor, lay a toy, a small metal car. It was completely out of place, just laying there, like it had been placed there. I told myself it was nothing, just something that had fallen off the shelf. No big deal. I bent down to pick it up. As I placed it back onto the shelf, a cold tingle ran over my skin. I tried to laugh it off, chiding myself for letting the manager's earlier warning get into my head. Settling back into my post, all was quiet for a short time. But then, out of nowhere, the lights began to flicker. I could feel it. I was alone, but not alone. It felt like someone, or something, was studying me. I felt like I needed reassurance, a way to prove to myself that it was all in my head. So, I returned to the floor of the department store, seeking out something that would provide me with the reassurance that I needed. That's when I saw the balloons, a cluster of them tied to an end cap, bobbing gently in the air, that I was now acutely aware had no current. With bravado I didn't feel, I issued my challenge to the empty store. If there's something here, some spirit or ghost, then pop one of those balloons. I waited, my heart pounding in a frantic rhythm. I stared at the balloons, listening, waiting. After a moment, I felt like the reassurance I was seeking had arrived. There was nothing, only silence. Wiping a thin layer of sweat off of my forehead, I gave myself a chuckle and started walking back towards my post. Before I could pivot, though, there was a sudden explosion from one of the balloons. It was as sudden as a lightning strike. The sound of the burst was deafening in the quiet, like a cannon blast that reverberated through the aisles and off the shelves. In that instant, my courage shattered. I didn't hesitate, didn't stop for anything. I left my post, the store, the job, all behind in a heart-pounding sprint for the door. I didn't even bother to lock it behind me. I never went back, not even to explain. But I don't think any explanation was needed. It's a situation I feel that the manager of the store has encountered before. It wasn't his first, and I certainly don't think that it'll be his last. For a few nights after that incident, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, that single loud pop still echoing in my ears. I tell myself it was just a balloon, that it was the pressure or a defect that made it burst. But in the dark of the night, when the world is silent and still, I wonder if I had been too quick to dismiss the manager's warnings. Story 2. Alone in the office. The dim hum of fluorescent lights overhead was all I could hear. The office was vast, open plan, and at this hour, eerily silent. I stayed late, really late, to catch up on a very important project, believing the stillness would help me concentrate. But as hours slipped away, the expansive floor filled not with peacefulness, but with a sense of unease. From my desk, I could see row after row of empty chairs and vacant cubicles. In the daytime, this place buzzed with activity, voices melding into a noise of workplace banter. But now, the silence was harsh. Around 10 p.m., my phone buzzed, a message notification. The screen displayed an unknown number. Enjoying the peace? I frowned. Perhaps it was someone from work, although the contact should have been saved. I typed back, "Who is this?" But there was no response. Shaking off a mild sense of anxiety, I decided to head to the break room for a coffee. As I passed through the maze of workstations, the hairs on my neck prickled. I felt observed, even though the office was supposedly empty. The break room's light was faulty, flickering intermittently, a nice spooky touch to an already creepy situation. As the coffee machine gurgled to life, another message appeared on my phone. "It's better in the dark." I felt a chill. I wasn't amused at all. Holding my phone tightly, I responded, "Who are you? This isn't funny." Instead of typing, the messenger sent an audio clip. Hesitantly, I played it. It was a recording of my own voice from earlier in the evening, speaking to a colleague. "I'll be staying late tonight. Don't wait up." Swallowing hard, I realized that whoever this was had been here, had been close enough to record my conversation. Panic gnawed at me. I needed to leave. I darted back to my desk to grab my belongings. On my way, I thought I caught a fleeting glimpse of someone in my periphery, just beyond the glow of the exit sign, but I couldn't tell if someone was really there, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. At my desk, I quickly shut down my computer and stuffed my papers into my bag. I heard a soft ping from my phone. Why the rush? We're only just getting acquainted. With adrenaline coursing through me, I bolted for the stairs, avoiding the elevators, too slow and too unpredictable. As I ran, I dialed the police. The operator's voice was calm as I explained my situation. She advised me to exit the building and wait in a safe place. As I reached the ground floor, I stole a glance behind me. There was nothing, just the quiet expanse of the office, the occasional flickering light, and that oppressive silence. I sprinted across the lobby and out into the chilly night. Gasping for breath, I looked around. The parking lot, dimly lit by the scattered street lamps, was empty. I could hear the distant hum of traffic, the only sign of life in the desolate scene. The police arrived within minutes, their blue and red lights breaking the stillness. They swept the building but found no one. My manager was informed, and after checking the security camera footage, he confirmed that no one had entered or left the building after me. The messages, they said, could have been someone's idea of a cruel joke, perhaps a coworker, but they took them seriously, especially given the voice recording. Weeks passed. The fear gradually faded, replaced by a low-grade paranoia. Every evening as the office emptied, I'd get that familiar unease, making me leave with the last group of colleagues. It was during one of those evenings, as a coworker and I shared an elevator to the parking lot, that she looked at me and said, "You know, I once stayed late here, just once. I felt watched the entire time." I stared at her, my pulse quickening. "Did anything happen?" She shook her head. "No messages or anything, just that feeling, like I wasn't really alone." The police never identified the number that texted me, saying it was likely a burner phone. As I think back to that night, and I think about the messages and the unknown individual, I find myself trying to determine what is more terrifying: the feeling of being completely alone in that vast office, or the chilling doubt that perhaps I never truly was when I should have been. Story 3. I'm no longer alone in the facility. Working at the storage facility was always peaceful, but mundane, a regular 9 to 5 with occasional customer interactions, paperwork, and keeping an eye on the camera. But everything changed after we were struck by a streak of break-ins. My boss asked if I would be okay holding down the fort during the lonely, dark graveyard shift, a precaution to deter the thieves, I suppose. She and another worker would take the day shifts, and I would take the nights. Just for a week, she said. Pay and a half was a good incentivization, so I took it. The shifts went by without a hitch. I mostly watched the monitors, chugged coffee, and played on my phone. Before my last shift on the last night, I was sent to Home Depot with the company card, and asked to fetch new bolt cutters since ours were done. They were old, rusted, and dull. It was then that I met a creepy man. He was there in the aisle, doing the same, looking for bolt cutters. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see him looking at me. He was just staring at me, and it was uncomfortably creepy. Finally, he asked about the storage facility that I worked at. As I looked over, he was pointing at the company shirt that I was wearing. "Yeah," I said. "Just picking up some bolt cutters. The ones we have are old." He nodded his head and continued with questions. "What time do I usually work? How many people work there? What hours are we typically open?" They were weird questions, and uncomfortable to say the least. Not wanting to answer any more questions, I finally picked out a pair of cutters. "Well, have a good one," I said. "You too," the creepy man said. As I turned to walk down the aisle, I felt like his eyes were on me the entire time. I paid and left, brushing off the exchange as just a weird encounter with a creepy man. Returning to the storage facility, I settled in for a long night. As the night progressed a few hours, a thunderstorm rolled in. The winds were picking up, and the rain was coming in heavily. As I was sitting behind the desk, looking out at the rain, I noticed movement on one of the cameras. There was a tall, skinny person that had just hopped the fence onto the grounds of the facility. The person looked to be a man. He was hooded and dressed in dark clothing. It looked like he was carrying something too. I inched closer to the monitor, trying to get a better look. As I strained to look, it dawned on me what he was carrying. Bolt cutters. The man looked around, and then started making his way to one of the units. I started to reach for my phone, but couldn't take my eyes off of the monitor. He was swinging the bolt cutters around to his other hand, when out of nowhere, he looked up and directly into the camera. My heart, by now pounding uncontrollably, dropped into my stomach. He was wearing a mask. It covered his nose and his mouth, obscuring his identity. But his eyes were visible, and it was as if they were staring directly into mine through the monitor. By this time, I should have already been on the phone with the police, but I was absolutely frozen. Then, his head slowly looked down as if he was looking at something in the distance. As I watched, my heart dropped even further when I realized that he was looking in the direction of the office. The very office that I was sitting in, watching all of this unfold. Slowly he dropped the bolt cutters to the ground, never taking his eyes off of the office. I was shaking, and it was almost like I was in a trance. There was a voice in my head yelling, "Call 911! Call 911!" But I couldn't hear it because I was locked onto the monitor. The man slowly set the cutters down, and then began to walk slowly over towards my office. As he did so, he placed one of his hands inside a pocket. Just as he walked out of frame, he began pulling his hand back out. I was able to pick him up on another camera though, but this time I was viewing his backside as he was slowly approaching the office, which was in frame too. As he pulled his hand out, I could barely make out something that almost made me pass out. It looked like he was pulling out a knife. Just then, there was a huge crack of thunder, and then, as if things couldn't get any worse for me, the electricity went out. It was pitch black now, and there was a guy walking towards the office I was in with what I believed to be a knife. If any good came out of the electricity going out though, when the monitor shut off, it was as if I was jolted out of my trance. I threw myself under the desk and finally called 911. "There's someone here and I think they have a knife," I said to the operator in a panic. "I need the police here now." As I was speaking with the operator, the unthinkable happened. I began to hear jiggling from the door handle at the back of the office. the one located on the facility side of the entrance gate. I began shaking uncontrollably. "I need someone here now," I said in a panic. The operator tried to comfort me. "We've got officers on the way." Because I was under the desk, I couldn't see anything except the wall behind it and the floor beneath me. But I could hear everything, and the man's determination to get into the office was escalating. Then, out of nowhere, the jiggling stopped. Any relief that I would have had was short-lived, though. After a brief pause, there was a huge bang. I wish it was thunder, but unfortunately it wasn't. The man was now trying to kick in the door. My eyes watered up with tears. "Please," I begged the operator. Another bang, this time more violent. At that moment, I felt like the next kick would burst open the door. I closed my eyes and braced myself for the final blow, the one that was going to leave nothing between the intruder and me. The tears were now pouring from my eyes, and I could barely control my breathing. I waited, for what felt like an eternity, for the final blow to come, and for the door to burst open. 5 seconds went by, then 10, then 15, but the final blow never came. After what felt like at least a minute, I slowly opened my eyes. They revealed red and blue lights flickering off the wall behind the desk. The cops had arrived. I crawled out from under the desk. There were 2 cop cars. The one in front was pointing its spotlight towards me in the office. I rushed out of the office towards them. 2 more cars arrived. I detailed what happened. Because the electricity was still out, I couldn't raise the gate. So all of the cops took off on foot except for one who stayed back with me. After a thorough search, they found nothing. No intruder, no bolt cutters, nothing. The man had made his way out, leaving nothing but a few dents in the back door of the office. An investigation took place, but in my opinion, it seemed to be low priority. Nothing was ever stolen, the intruder never made entry into the office, and nobody was hurt. I even told them about the creepy man at Home Depot. I'm not sure they ever followed up on him. They did some extra patrols for a few nights, but after about a week or so, those stopped, and it was like nothing ever happened. Questions still haunt me. Who was this person, and why were they trying to get into the office? Why didn't they just try to steal something from a unit and then leave? Who was the creepy man at Home Depot, and did he have anything to do with this? Amongst these questions, there is one thing I do know for certain. I will never work another graveyard shift ever again. Story 4. The Girl at the Door. I never thought an overnight shift at a fast food restaurant could turn into the most horrifying night of my life. My manager, Daryl, approached me one day with his usual nonchalant demeanor, asking me to work an overnight cleaning shift in preparation for a visit from some high-level executives the following morning. Despite the short notice and unusual hours, from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., I agreed, recognizing the urgency in his request. The night started typically. As soon as the lobby closed at 10 p.m., I began my work, scouring every inch of the restaurant to ensure it was pristine for the upcoming visit. The drive-thru crew worked busily, providing a subtle background noise that broke the eerie silence typical of late-night shifts. After their departure around 1 a.m., the restaurant fell into a silence that, for some reason, heightened my alertness. It wasn't until 1:30 a.m., when an unexpected timid knock at the lobby door jolted my attention. There, through the glass, stood a young girl, no older than 20, her eyes pooling with a mix of desperation and urgency. She gestured toward her phone, and then made a talking motion with her hand, signaling she needed to make a call. My instincts, typically inclined towards assistance, nudged me to help her. The battery on my phone died. "Can I use yours to make a call?" she asked through the glass door. It was strict policy that we were to never unlock the door or let anyone in after hours. This included family and friends, and it definitely included complete strangers. She looked so innocent, though, and my heartstrings pulled to help her out. Yet something felt unsettlingly off about the situation. My hand hovered over the door lock, hesitation now building. But just as I made the decision to go ahead and unlock it, I noticed a subtle movement in the dimly lit periphery of the parking lot. My heart pounded loudly in my ears as I leaned slightly, trying to get a better view of the shadow lurking just around the corner of the building. "Hey," she said. "Are you going to open the door?" Her pleas, though seemingly genuine, concealed an undercurrent of urgency that didn't quite align with her initial mild demeanor. I hesitated more. "Open the door now," she snapped at me. Her face had now completely changed. The distressed damsel she'd presented just moments before was now gone, and what stood on the other side of the window seemed annoyed and frustrated. I shook my head slightly, gesturing that I would use my phone to call someone for her. "I'll call the cops for you," I said. "They can come and help you." She now appeared to be fuming. Nevertheless, I went to retrieve my phone. When I returned, she was gone. Nowhere to be found. I looked all around the periphery of the restaurant. There was no one. The remaining half hour until my shift ended was nothing but fear, paranoia, and second-guessing. When my shift ended, I darted to my car as fast as I could. I never saw the girl again. Looking back now, the whole situation makes my hair stand on end. I was just a hesitation away from unlocking that door. Then what? Who was in the dark corner of the parking lot? What was their intent? Thankfully, I'll be able to ponder over those questions. Had I opened that door, though, it might be a different story. Story 5. My brother's cabin. I've experienced many things in my life, but nothing quite as terrifying as what I experienced one weekend at my brother's cabin in the northern woods of Michigan. It was 2004, and I was 35 years old. I was old enough to know that peace and quiet was a luxury that should be jumped on any time the opportunity arises. So, when I decided to take a weekend off for some much-needed rest and relaxation, I turned to my older brother who owned a cabin in the woods. The location seemed perfect, secluded, serene, and away from the noise of town. My brother, however, looked uneasy when I asked for the keys. "Just keep an eye out on the woods, all right?" I remember him saying. It was as if he knew something I didn't, but didn't want to say no, and didn't want to go into any more detail. Shrugging it off as him just being protective, I thanked him, packed some things up, and headed out. The drive to the cabin was long and winding, lots of dirt roads, hills, and trees. The cabin itself, however, was simple, just a one-room cabin with a bed, table, chairs, a porch on the front, and not much else. Tall trees swayed in the breeze, birds chirped, and the comforting warmth of the sun peeked through the canopies. When I got there, I unloaded my gear, set up a small fire outside, kicked back, and let the stress I carried from the outside world dissipate into the forest. I remember closing my eyes and letting the peace of my surroundings lull me into sleep. I don't remember how long I was out, but I do remember being snapped out of my sleep by a huge grunt. I sat up and looked around. It was just after dusk now, and the once peaceful forest took on a different tone. Scanning the surrounding woods, I couldn't see or hear anything. Maybe that grunt was just in my head, I thought to myself. Or maybe it was a deer. Either way, it was getting dark now, so I began tidying up and getting set to turn in for the night. I wanted to get up early the next morning and hike out to a nearby lake and do some fishing. I was sitting up in bed, reading a book, as soft moonlight came in from one of the windows. As before, my eyelids got heavier and heavier until I drifted off to sleep. The silence was broken when I began to hear footsteps on the porch. It sounded human, like someone on 2 feet, but the footsteps were hard and heavy. My heart began pounding. Who could possibly be out here? I was out in the middle of nowhere. My eyes locked onto the door. As if I stared hard enough, I'd be able to see through it to whoever was on the other side. Not knowing what else to do, I called out, "Who's there?" But there was no answer. Just complete silence. Suddenly, a scratching sound ran across the door. It was soft at first, but then became louder and louder. Was this some kind of sick joke? Who or what in the hell was at the door? I didn't know what to do. I was too terrified to move. All I could do was hope that whatever it was would go away. Unfortunately, any hope that I had was quickly lost when the door handle began moving. Whatever it was looking for a way to get inside. I began to panic. I had no weapons on me. Something was trying to get in, and I was out in the middle of nowhere by myself. I nervously looked around the interior of the cabin for something that I could use to defend myself. I didn't know what else to do. It was then that I saw my keys. There, on the table. A desperate idea struck me. I lunged for them and hit the alarm button. The blaring sound echoed throughout the woods, and just as suddenly as it had begun, the jiggling stopped. There was a huge noise off the front porch, 2 huge bangs that I assumed were footsteps. I quickly leaned over towards the window and was just in time to see something darting into the woods. There was enough light to see that whatever it was huge, but not enough light to make out any detail. One thing I knew for certain, though, that was no man. Wasting no time, I felt like this was my one and only opportunity. I threw on my clothes, exited the front door, and ran to my truck. When I got inside, I started it up and peeled out of there as fast as I could. I drove straight home, shaking the entire way, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Early the next morning, I paid a visit to my brother. He was surprised to see me. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I thought you were out at the cabin." I relayed everything that had happened to me. He looked at me with a puzzled yet worried look. "Maybe it was someone just screwing with you," he said. "No, there's something out there," I replied back. After a few minutes of back and forth, he agreed to accompany me back out there. I had left behind quite a bit of gear, and I wanted to retrieve it. Pulling back into the cabin, I was filled with dread. As we parked and got out of the truck, everything seemed normal. As before, the birds were chirping, and the sun was shining brightly through the trees. I took a few steps towards the cabin, and that's when I first noticed them. There were hoofprints on the ground. "Look," I said to my brother. I watched as his gaze turned down towards the dirt. "Somebody's been out here with a horse," he said. "No," I replied. "Over here." His eyes scanned to look over in my direction. I pointed at the ground. This thing was on 2 legs. I still remember the look in his eyes as he tried to process what we were seeing. From some of the prints on the ground, you could clearly see that whatever made these hoofprints was on 2 legs. I blurted out, "What in the hell has hoofprints and walks on 2?" But before I could finish, my brother cut me off. "Just get your stuff and let's get out of here." He didn't have to ask twice. I gathered my stuff, and we made our way out. Any time I ever brought up the incident, my brother would change the subject, or the expression on his face would turn distant, and he'd refuse to discuss it further. A year later, to my surprise, he sold the cabin. When I asked why, his reply was short: "Don't need it anymore." To this day, I wonder what he knows about that cabin and those woods. I think he had his own experience at some point. Maybe not as bad as mine, but his own experience nonetheless. I think the best way that he knows how to deal with it is to just not talk about it. My hope is that one day when he's ready, he'll tell me about it. Story 6. The New Guy in the Neighborhood. A few years back, I moved into the house I'm living in now. At the time, it was a new development. It was one of those places where they planned to fill up the street with homes, but so far, it was just me and one other house across the street and a couple of lots down. The rest were just empty lots, which gave the whole street a kind of eerie, unfinished feel. One night, shortly after I moved in, I was reading a book in my bedroom when I decided to go to the kitchen to grab a drink of water. As I was drinking, I glanced out the front window and noticed some light coming from the direction of the neighbor's house. I hadn't met the neighbor yet, but knew that someone lived there. I joked to my friends that I was the new guy in the neighborhood, even though it was just me and the person across the street. Peering through the window, I could just make out a car parked outside, and what looked like a figure standing at the front door. It was too dark, and the figure was too far away to see any details, but I assumed it was my neighbor. I watched for a short time, but after little activity, I didn't think much of it, finished my water, and headed back to bed. Back in my room, I dove back into my book, but after about 5 minutes or so, a noise from the front of the house caught my attention. It was a subtle sound at first, so I brushed it off and tried to focus on my reading. I figured I was imagining things, telling myself that these new houses sometimes settle and make strange noises. But the noise didn't stop. In fact, it got louder. I rationalized to myself that it might be an animal, maybe a raccoon. Feeling a mix of annoyance and unease, I got up to check it out. I crept down the hallway, not wanting to turn on the lights just yet, thinking maybe I could catch a glimpse of what it was. I angled myself at my front window to try to get a look at my front door, but it was too dark to see anything. As I backed away from the window, though, I looked back over at my neighbor's house. The car was still there, but the person at the front door was gone. That's when the noise at my door got louder, more insistent. It had to be a raccoon, I thought to myself. I quietly inched my way over to the door. Without thinking much further, I switched on the porch light and yanked the door open at the same time, ready to confront a small animal. But it wasn't a raccoon. It was a man, right there on my doorstep, his hand frozen midair, reaching for my screen door. We locked eyes, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The guy looked rough, wild-eyed, and desperate, like he was running on something more than just adrenaline. He had a look of surprise on his face, as I'm sure I did as well. Both of us stood there, as if each of us was calculating our next move. Suddenly, he reached for the screen door and started shaking it violently, as if he had made his decision and was trying to tear it open. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding in my chest, and yelled through the door that I was calling the cops. As I backpedaled, I could see him through the window, running into the front yard, pausing for a second as if considering his options, then running back to the car in the neighbor's driveway. It was then that I realized that the car and man across the street wasn't my neighbor, but a man trying to get into my neighbor's house. I called the police, and they came out pretty quickly, but by then, the guy was long gone. They took my statement and did a quick check around the house and the neighbors. The man, whoever it was, had broken into my neighbor's house and then made his way over to mine. I would later find out that luckily, my neighbor wasn't at home and was on vacation at the time. The cops said they'd keep an eye on the neighborhood, but I never got word back that the man had been caught. I installed some extra locks and a security system after that. I even met the neighbors when they got back. We talked about the incident, and they were as shaken up about it as I was. Like me, they installed cameras to beef up the security around their property. Since that time, the neighborhood has grown now. Most of the lots have been developed, and it feels more like a community than it did before, when it was just my neighbor and me. That night was a terrifying night to say the least, and I'm just glad that no one got hurt. It was an experience that I'll never forget, and so far, it is the only bad one I've ever had in my new home. Hopefully it stays that way. Story 7. Vengeful Guest. I've always been a bit of an outdoors guy, but working 60-hour weeks at the office had left me with little time to enjoy the wilderness. That's why when my buddy told me about this cabin in the woods you could rent on Airbnb, I didn't think twice. He said it was a great spot to unwind. So there I was, driving my old Jeep through the dense forest to a place I found online, expecting nothing but the sound of crickets and owls in the night. The cabin was straight out of one of those old wilderness paintings. You know, the ones with the big front porch, a couple of rocking chairs, and that homey feel. I remember pulling up and thinking, this is it, this is perfect. Unloading my stuff, I could feel the stress melting off me with every step I took towards that front door. The first few hours were exactly what I hoped for. I popped open a beer, sat on the porch, and just listened. There was a kind of music to the woods that city life drowns out. As the evening crept in, I grilled a steak and soaked in the solitude. When night fell, I settled in front of the fireplace. The flames flickered and danced, and it was as close to heaven as I'd ever felt. It was cozy, almost hypnotic, but the feeling didn't last. You know that sense you get when you think someone's watching you? I began to feel that, but every time I glanced out the window, I saw nothing. Just my own reflection and the dark outline of the trees against the sky. I tried to shake it off and decided to call it a night, hoping sleep would reset everything. But then, just as I was dozing off, I heard a huge bang. It was so loud and sudden, my heart went from 0 to 100 in a blink. I've heard noises in the night before, a branch falling, an animal nosing around. But this was different. This was deliberate. With my heart punching at 100 miles per hour, I approached the door, every horror movie I'd ever seen playing in my head. Opening it, I half expected to be met with some axe murderer's grin. Instead, what I found was a rabbit. It was dead. Its lifeless body looked like it had been thrown there, intentionally. There was no blood, No sign of a struggle. Just a motionless body lying there. It didn't add up. The panic that hit wasn't the adrenaline kind you get when you're pumped. It was cold, heavy. It filled my chest and didn't let go. I felt exposed, vulnerable. After I slammed the door shut and dialed the cops, I spent the next hour pacing around the cabin, every creak and crackle of the woodwork making me jump. The officers who showed up were locals, familiar with the woods and the wildlife. They took a look around, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, but they came back with nothing. They said it could be kids messing around or someone with a sick sense of humor. They told me to lock up and call again if anything else happened. But even after they left, the sense of security that should have come with their presence just wasn't there. The next day, I reached out to the host, a nice enough guy who seemed as perplexed as I was. He confirmed no one had ever reported anything like this before. Nevertheless, the harrowing ordeal soured my excitement for the retreat, and I canceled the rest of my reservation. As the weeks passed on, the events of that night never left my mind. With curiosity clawing at me, I kept track of the listings' reviews, seeing if anyone had experienced anything similar to what I had. Stories from other guests trickled in, each one with a tale of late-night frights, things just weird enough to make you want to leave and never come back. A few months later, the full picture of what was truly going on out at that cabin came to light. Late one night, the cops pulled over a guy for speeding, not very far from the cabin. As they spoke with the individual, he seemed nervous and erratic. Upon closer inspection of his vehicle, there in the trunk of his car, they found a dead rabbit. After pressing the man for some time, he admitted to being the one behind the disturbances. He was a previous guest, a vengeful guest, who'd had some minor disagreement with the host. His way of getting back was to sabotage the cabin's reputation, to drive guests away with fear, hoping they'd plaster the internet with bad reviews. When I think back on that weekend, my mind is a mix of anger towards the vengeful guest and sadness for the host. It's a story I've shared with some of my friends, a modern-day cautionary tale of how far some people will go over the smallest things. And while I still love the woods, maybe next time, I'll go somewhere with a few more people around, just in case. Story 8. Déjà Vu. The monotony of the night shift at the gas station was my little slice of peace, a place where the most excitement I expected was the occasional drifter passing through, or the rumble of a late-night trucker. There's one night, though, that I'll never forget. A shift that started just like any other, but ended up being anything but ordinary. It was a typical night. The air was stagnant, and the only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights above. I was killing time flipping through a car magazine, when, at the stroke of midnight, the bell above the door announced a customer. He was an average-looking guy, but dressed strangely in a thick, heavy coat that seemed out of place for a night that called for a light jacket at best. His eyes darted around the store before settling on me, and he approached the counter with a hesitant step. "Can you tell me how to get to Smithville?" he asked. You'd think in this day and age that any phone could easily pull up any location and give you turn-by-turn directions anywhere. But not wanting to engage in too much conversation with the guy, I elected not to say anything about it, and figured it'd just be easier to give him the directions and send him about his way. "Sure," I said, laying down the magazine. "You're going to take a left out of the parking lot. Follow the road for about 15 miles, then you'll see the sign. Can't miss it." He nodded, thanked me, and turned to leave, but not before I heard him muttering under his breath. It was too low for me to catch the words, and I was left with a small amount of unease. But hey, people are odd, and working nights you see a fair share of odd. An hour passed, uneventfully, and the digital clock on the wall read 1 a.m. That's when the bell chimed again, and if I hadn't known better, I'd have sworn I was experiencing déjà vu. The same guy, same coat, same uncertain gait. He came up to the counter with no sign of recognition, and asked, "Can you tell me how to get to Smithville?" "You just asked me that," I said, my confusion edging into my voice. "An hour ago? Don't you remember?" He blinked, a perfect picture of bewilderment. "Come again?" he said. "Weren't you in here an hour ago asking me the same question?" I said. I think I'd remember if I had been here before, he replied. I was confused, but like before, I wasn't up for conversation, so I provided the directions again. He took the directions once again, this time with a nod and that same indecipherable mutter. By the time 2 a.m. rolled around, I was feeling the kind of creeped out that you can't shake, that gets under your skin. Sure enough, like a clock striking the hour, he was back. The same question, the same coat, the same everything. I confronted him, saying, "Look, man, this isn't funny. You've been here twice asking for the same thing." The guy fixed me with a stare, a blend of confusion and something else, something darker. "Buddy, this is the first time I've ever seen you," he said, but the sincerity in his voice was as thin as tissue paper. He left once again, but this time I was locked in, focusing hard on what the man had been muttering under his breath the last few times he left. As he left with a repeat of his now familiar muttering, a cold dread settled in my stomach. "See you soon," I heard him whisper. This was no longer just strange, it was alarming. 3 a.m. couldn't come fast enough, and with it, a resolution formed sharp and clear in my mind. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for whatever this was to escalate. I locked the door, a flimsy barrier between me and whatever was out there, but it was something. An hour later, right on cue, he came back, but this time the locked door stopped him. "Hey man, unlock the door," he said. "I need to get some directions." "Hell no," I replied back. The transformation was immediate. The average Joe with the too heavy coat became a maniac. He started pounding on the door, cursing at me with an expression of rage and desperation. "I need to know how to get to Smithville," he screamed, his voice unhinged. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs, and told him, "I can't help you, man." He continued to shout and bang on the door, his face a mask of fury, his eyes wild. That's when I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline as I explained the situation. The police arrived within minutes, but the man had vanished into the night as if he had never been there. They took my statement, their brows creased in concern, or maybe skepticism, and suggested drugs or mental illness might be at play, but nothing about this felt that simple. When the sun came up and the morning crew arrived, I was still there, a complete wreck from the events of the night. They found me rattled, recounting the night's events as if saying them out loud would make sense of it all. But it didn't. Nothing about that night or the multiple encounters with the man made any sense. I requested to not work any more night shifts alone in that gas station anymore. At first, management was accommodating, but as time went on, the request became more and more difficult to fulfill. Ultimately, I ended up having to find a new job. That night has stayed with me. Who in the hell was that man? Was he just trying to freak me out? What was his true intentions? Something tells me the man never made it to Smithville. Something tells me he never had any intentions of ever going there in the first place. Story 9. Worked too hard. Let me tell you about this one night that I won't be forgetting anytime soon. It was a night like any other, or so I thought, when I clocked in for my cleaning shift at the downtown offices. The building was as quiet as a tomb, just the way it always was at night. I started from the top and worked my way down, floor by floor, with nothing but the hum of the air conditioning for company. By the time I hit the 4th floor, it was around 1 a.m. I unlocked the door and pushed my cart through, expecting the usual silence, but instead, I was greeted by this soft, yet creepy moaning sound. It was faint, coming from the far corner of the floor. My heart started pounding right away. "Hello?" I called out, hoping to get a friendly response back, but there was no answer. I thought maybe I was just tired hearing things. But then there it was again, a moan, clearer this time. Now I'm not one to scare easy, but something about that sound made my hair stand straight up. I stood there for a good minute, trying to decide if I really wanted to know what was making that noise. Finally, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. Slowly moving past the cubicles, the moaning got louder and louder. As I crept towards the back of the office, I saw something that absolutely terrified me. I could make out a shadowy figure swaying in the back corner. "Hey, you okay?" I called out, but all I got back was another moan. At this point, This became too much for me, and every instinct told me to turn tail and get out of there. I turned and began to make my way out, but just as I did, I heard a thud, like someone had just dropped a load of books, and the moaning got louder. I froze for a second, then turned around expecting I don't know what. But the figure was gone. I could still hear soft moans and murmurs, though. I don't know what possessed me, but I decided I had to know what was going on. Maybe it was concern. Maybe it was the fear of not knowing. Any rational person would have left and called security by now. But there I was, creeping closer to where I'd seen the figure. As I neared the back of the office, what I saw was unexpected to say the least. There, in the dim light from the exit sign, I saw feet. I was confused, terrified, panicked, and worried all at the same time. Was this a trap to lure me in closer? Or was there someone there that truly needed help? I swallowed hard and moved closer. Finally, I could see that it was a man, all dressed up in a suit, lying there on the floor. I recognized him. He was one of those high flyers from the legal department, always glued to his phone. But there he was, flat out on the carpet, looking nothing like the sharp guy who barely gave me a nod when I passed him in the hallway. He was pale, sweating like he'd run a marathon. I called security right away, and they came running. They called an ambulance, and he was taken away to the hospital. I later learned that the man had been under a lot of stress, popping pills for anxiety. He'd been trying to catch up on work, meet some impossible deadline, and had taken one too many of a cocktail of drugs. That night, I saw firsthand what a job and what stress can do to a person. I finished cleaning the floor in silence, thinking about the man and the pressure he must have been under. It was the scariest thing I've ever encountered, the sounds in the corner of the office, the shadowy figure swaying back and forth. It was a lot for my system to try to process, working alone in the dead of the night. As I locked up the building before dawn, I couldn't help but think about how thin the line is we all walk between keeping it together and falling apart. For the man, I guess sometimes the scariest things in life aren't shadows and moans, but battles that come from inside. Story 10. Watch what you sell. Back when I was 24, my girlfriend at the time, Laura, decided I needed something flashy for my birthday, so she bought me a really nice, expensive watch. Her family was rolling in money, so she didn't even blink at dropping that kind of cash. But for a guy like me, it was overkill. We split up eventually, and she didn't even think to ask for it back. Maybe for her it was just a drop in the bucket. A couple of years later, I stumbled upon it in a drawer I had thrown it in and forgot about. After our breakup, I never wore it. It felt like a leftover from a past life, but it was still worth a good chunk of change, and I was wanting to buy a new car, something that fit me better than a flashy watch ever did. Selling the watch seemed like the smart move. It would be a couple of dollars I could drop in the bank to go towards saving up for the car. I snapped a couple of pics and posted it on Craigslist. I set the price high, figuring I'd come down if I had to. I didn't really expect to get what I was asking for, but it was worth a shot. The next day, I got a message from a woman. She was very sweet and sincere. She was interested in buying the watch for her husband's birthday. She told me how much they were in love, and how perfect my watch would be for him. Her story was heartwarming, and honestly, it made me kind of miss what I had with Laura before things got rocky. She asked if she could come by and pick it up from my place. Now, I'm not usually down for letting strangers know where I live, but she had a way of making me feel like I knew her. There was something about the way she talked about her husband that made me let my guard down. So I gave her my address and we set a time for her to come by. She thanked me, said she couldn't wait to see the watch, and made me feel pretty good about myself. The day we agreed upon rolled around, and I waited, and waited. But she was a no-show. I messaged her, trying not to sound as stood up as I felt, but nothing. No reply, no explanation. I tried to not let it get to me, but it stung more than I expected. I decided to give it a day or two to allow her time to message me back. Who knows, I thought to myself. Maybe she had an emergency or something. My thoughts about the whole ordeal would change drastically, though. Later that night, I was jolted awake by a strange noise coming from my back door. I looked at the clock, and it was a little bit after 2 a.m. Somewhat alarmed, I listened carefully as I got up out of bed. I slowly crept down the hall, hoping my mind was just playing tricks on me. But it wasn't. The sound I was hearing was the jiggle of my back door handle. Before I could process that something was really happening, there was a huge bang. I knew right then someone was breaking into my house. Panic isn't even the word for what I felt. My mind raced, thinking about what I should do. I knew that somebody was already in my house, and I remember thinking to myself, if I called the cops now, it'd be too late by the time they arrived. So the only thing that I could think to do was something kind of crazy. I flipped the light to the hall on and shouted out the biggest lie of my life. In the loudest, most intimidating voice that I could muster up, I yelled that I had a gun and that the cops were on their way. The best chance I've got, I thought to myself, was to try to scare this person away. Luckily for me, it worked. I could hear scrambling, stuff getting knocked over, and then the sound of someone running out the back. As I ran back to my room to grab my phone and dial the cops for real, I took a look out of my bedroom window, just in time to see a huge man booking it through the neighbor's yard. As I explained the situation to the operator, I could see a car tearing down the next street over as fast as it could go. Unfortunately for me, it was too dark to make out any details. The cops showed up and did their jobs. They asked questions and took notes, but it was clear that they weren't going to have a lot to work with. Nothing was taken, so for me, it felt like nothing was going to come of it, and nothing ever did. Reflecting back, I'm pretty sure it was a Craigslist scammer. There was no sweet woman with a story, just someone looking for an easy score from a person naive enough to fall into the trap. They didn't get the watch, but unfortunately, they took my peace of mind. I learned a tough lesson that night. I keep my dealings strictly public now. Meetups are in public places with lots of people. As for the watch, I eventually just pawned it off at a shop to get something for it and not have to deal with it anymore. The whole ordeal was a tough way to learn that not everyone is who they say they are, and that sometimes the price of trust is just way too high. Story 11. Something was in the walls. At 25, I thought I had my life somewhat figured out. I'd just landed a decent job in a new town, and I was buzzing with the excitement of starting fresh. The town had this quiet charm to it, a mix of suburban homes and local businesses. I had a friend that lived in that town in a one-bedroom apartment. He let me crash on his couch while I worked away trying to find a place to live. After a bit of hunting, I settled on a rental house that seemed perfect for my needs. Before I signed the lease, the landlord, an older gentleman with a stern face and graying hair, shared a tidbit that gave me pause. The previous tenant had been evicted for dealing drugs out of the house. He made it sound like everything happened pretty quickly. The previous guy was out, and I took over the place soon after. I appreciated his honesty, but it made me uneasy. Still, the place was great for the price, and I convinced myself that whatever had gone down before was none of my business. The first few days went smoothly. I explored the town, found a nice local gym, and even a coffee shop that made an impressive cappuccino. The house felt like home, and I was settling in well. Everything seemed pretty normal for the first few days. I got into a routine: work, gym, dinner, Netflix, sleep, repeat. On the Friday of that first week, after work, I decided to stop by the local convenience store. It had this old-school vibe, with neon lights and a bell that jingled every time the door opened. As I picked out a bag of chips, I could see someone approaching me out of the corner of my eye. Turning around, I was met by this huge guy. He was at least 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders and an intense look. He shot me a wide grin, introducing himself as Jake. He seemed overly friendly. His laugh was deep and echoed in the store, and he patted my back a bit too hard as we chatted. He asked about where I was from, what I did, the usual small talk. But then he suddenly invited me to play some pool at a local club that night. I wasn't too keen on the idea, so I made up a quick excuse about camping with friends that night. I said. That's actually why I'm here. I'm picking up some snacks for the trip. His eyebrows perked up a bit, as if oddly interested in that statement. Oh, so you won't be home tonight? He asked. Yeah, that's right, I responded, trying to end the conversation. The excuse seemed to work, almost a little too well. "All right, man, well, have fun on your camping trip," he said. And with that, he patted me on the back one last time, abruptly turned, and walked away. Not trying to think too much into it, I finished up my shopping, paid for my things, and left. When I got home, I got a text from my buddy. "Come on over and have some beers," he said. Not having anything else to do, I took him up on the offer. We talked about old times, had a few drinks, and before I knew it, it was way past midnight. He offered his couch, but I was stubborn. I had crashed on that couch one too many times already and wanted my bed. Too intoxicated to drive, I got an Uber, and the last thing I remember was falling face first onto my mattress. A few hours later, I was jolted awake. My head throbbed from the alcohol, but it was unmistakable. There was glass breaking coming from the back of the house, from the back door. I heard a click, and then the creak of the door opening. In a panic, I reached for my phone, but my hand knocked it off the nightstand. I scanned the floor but couldn't find it. My head was throbbing and everything was spinning. I could hear footsteps, and they were getting closer. Not being able to find my phone in the dark, I made a split decision and crawled to the closet. With the door closed, I tried to control my breathing and waited. There was nothing else that I could do. Then I began to hear large banging noises coming from the spare bedroom. I would hear a bang, then the sound of something being torn apart, and then more banging and more tearing. This repeated over and over for a few minutes, and then, just as suddenly as the noises started, they stopped. For a moment, there was an eerie silence, then hurried footsteps back towards the back of the house. I heard the back door shut, and then it was deafeningly silent. Emerging from the closet, I was met with a shocking sight. One of the walls in the back bedroom had a massive hole in it. Whoever was in my house seemed to be looking for something in the wall, and from the looks of it, they found whatever they were looking for. I finally found my phone and called the police. A thorough investigation ensued over the coming weeks, but unfortunately, the officers were unable to piece together any solid leads. They did, however, share a theory with me. They believed the previous tenant had hidden something in the walls, maybe drugs or cash. Believing that no one was home, someone broke in and retrieved whatever the items were. They questioned the previous tenant, but he played dumb. They suspected Jake from the convenience store was linked to the former tenant. Unfortunately for me, the cameras at the convenience store didn't work, so without solid evidence or even a clear identity, the police officers' hands were tied. The aftermath of that night left me shaken for a while. Sleepless nights followed, but eventually normalcy settled in. Reflecting on everything, I never would have guessed that there could be something hidden behind drywall and paint. I had moved to this town seeking a fresh start, but it seemed the house's past was far from behind it. Story 12. The Previous Tenant. 2 years ago, when I hit 28, I decided I had enough of apartment living. I lived in one of those high-rise buildings in the city, the kind where you can hear your neighbor's TV through the walls, the hum of elevators, and every conversation in the hallway. I really wanted some space, peace, and a bit of greenery, to be honest. So I started searching for a house that I could rent, something on the outskirts of the city, away from the rush and daily chaos. With surprisingly little work, I found a nice place. It was a simple brick house, nestled in a small community, with a porch that overlooked a tree-lined street. The backyard was a decent size, with a shed and some overgrown bushes. The inside needed a little TLC, but I saw potential. The price was within my budget, so I took the plunge. Moving day was a blur. Boxes everywhere, friends helping out, things misplaced, things missing, things broken. By evening, my new home started to take shape. The living room had my old couch facing the TV, the kitchen had my mom's hand-me-down pots and pans, and the bedroom had my bed set up, with the window overlooking the street. I remember that first night pretty well. After everyone left, I decided to hit the sack early. I knew I had a lot to do the next day, so I wanted to get some rest. I switched off the lights, and a soft glow from the streetlight outside came into my room. As I was drifting off, I thought I saw a shadow move across my window. I sat up, heart racing a bit, and looked out. The street was deserted. Probably just my imagination, I thought. I chalked it up to just being in a new, unfamiliar house, and the creepiness that comes with that. The next day was all about settling in. I organized, took frequent breaks, kicked back on the couch, and even threw back a beer or two. That's when I first noticed it, this old blue sedan with dark-tinted windows. It drove past my house slowly. Didn't think much of it at first. But then I saw it again, doing another round. And again. I felt this nagging feeling at the back of my mind. Something wasn't right. On its fourth round, I decided to make my presence known. I stepped out onto the porch, making it obvious that I was watching. The car didn't stop, but it definitely sped up. Night came, and I was exhausted from all the day's work. I double-checked all the locks, something I picked up from living in the city, and went to bed. I don't know what time it was, but I was jolted awake by a loud banging on the front door. Someone was outside. It sounded like they were pissed, and they were shouting, "This is my house! Get out!" I went from dead asleep to trying to process unhinged chaos in a matter of seconds. My heart was absolutely pounding. Every worst-case scenario I'd ever imagined was playing out in my mind. Before I could even reach my phone, there were more bangs, louder and more violent. "Get out now!" the voice screamed. In a frantic rush, I grabbed my phone from the bedside table. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. With what little courage I could muster up, I shouted back, "The police are on their way!" The banging stopped abruptly. I rushed to the front window and peeked through the blinds. As I did, I saw a figure sprinting towards that familiar blue sedan. The person hopped into the driver's seat and sped away. The cops came, took a statement, and did a sweep of the area. One of the officers recognized the description of the car and the man. Turns out, he was the previous tenant, evicted due to unpaid rents and multiple disagreements with the landlord. He'd disappeared for a while, leaving behind his belongings. The landlord eventually cleared out his stuff, and when the man returned, he was not happy about it. The tenant put the house up for rent, and I was the first tenant since. The next week or two was uneasy. Every noise at night and every car that passed by put me on edge. But as weeks turned into months, the fear subsided. The old blue sedan was nowhere to be seen, and the previous tenant never showed up again. Life got into a rhythm, and I even got a dog. Other than those first 2 nights, my stay here at this house has been everything I wanted. I marked that second night as a one-off event. But still, it was easily one of the most terrifying nights of my life.